The security guard reached for his walkie, eyes locked on the black teen in the honors hoodie. "Sir, we have a code red, possible intruder." But Malik wasn't trespassing. He'd just been voted valedictorian. And what he was holding in his hand, it wasn't a weapon, it was his acceptance letter to Yale. So why were the police already surrounding the gym? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Jefferson Hills Middle School had a reputation to protect. Tucked into a sprawling tree-lined suburb outside Atlanta, the school prided itself on academic excellence, parental involvement, and a near-obsessive culture of performance. Every bulletin board displayed graphs of rising test scores. Every hallway showcased photos of smiling honor roll students. But the truth was simpler and colder. Jefferson Hills didn't see students. It saw statistics. Jalen Carter was the kind of student the school liked to forget. 13, black, small for his age, smart, but quiet. Always alone, always tucked into the back corner of the classroom, eyes focused on his notebook. Teachers rarely called on him unless they had to. And when they did, they often blinked in surprise at how precise his answers were. Still, no one ever asked him how he got so sharp, or where he learned to dissect equations faster than the rest of the class, or why his handwriting was so meticulous, like someone who knew that being average wasn't an option. They didn't ask because they didn't expect much. It was a silent prejudice, the kind that wore khakis and smiled through meetings. In a school where PTA moms wore designer bags and dropped off gluten-free lunches, Jalen arrived alone every morning. He came in early, left late, and stayed out of trouble. That's what his mother had taught him. Lay low. Don't give them a reason. Danielle Carter had worked as a janitor at Jefferson Hills for almost 4 years. No one ever asked her why someone with such sharp diction and quiet confidence was scrubbing toilets or wiping down cafeteria tables. They assumed her story without asking. She never corrected them. Every afternoon, once the last bell rang and the halls emptied out, she switched uniforms. She went from mom to worker in a matter of minutes. But her eyes always stayed on Jalen. She knew how these places worked, knew how easy it was to disappear in a school like this, if you looked like her son, and she wasn't about to let that happen. Danielle never complained. Not when parents pretended not to see her. Not when teachers walked past her like furniture. Not even when administrators misspelled her name on her ID badge. But everything changed that Thursday afternoon. It started with a knock. Principal Lawrence Dalton was reviewing budget proposals in his office, glasses perched low on his nose, when his secretary buzzed in. "Mr. Dalton, there's a staff member here to see you. Says it's important." "Can it wait?" he asked, distracted. "It's the janitor. Miss Carter." Dalton furrowed his brow. "Send her in," he sighed. Danielle stepped in, still in her navy work shirt and gray pants. Her ID badge swung gently against her chest. Her hands were clean but dry, knuckles slightly cracked from years of bleach and industrial soap. But it was her eyes that caught Dalton off guard. Steady, calm, measured. "Miss Carter," he said politely. "Everything all right?" She nodded, then said, "I'm here about my son." Dalton looked puzzled. "Your son?" "Jalen. Jalen Carter. 7th grade. Dalton blinked. Searched his memory. He could barely place the name. "I didn't realize Jalen was your son," he said slowly. "No one does," she replied. "You all see him every day. But you don't see him." Dalton shifted in his seat, sensing something beneath the surface. Danielle leaned forward slightly. "My son came home yesterday. Said he finished the math test in half the time. Said he nailed every question, but he also said his teacher looked at him strange, like he did something wrong." Dalton tried to interject. She raised her hand, calm but firm. "I'm not here to complain. I'm here to make something clear." Dalton nodded slowly. "Go on." Danielle reached into her worn leather bag and pulled out a folder. Inside were pages and pages of printed worksheets, handwritten equations, and problem sets dated over the last 2 years. She placed it gently on his desk. "I'm his tutor," she said. "Every night, after work, after dinner, after he finishes his chores, I sit with him. We solve equations together. I make mock tests. I grade them. I challenge him. I trained him to be better than this school expects him to be." Dalton didn't move. Danielle pointed to one page. A trigonometry problem far beyond middle school curriculum. He solved this in under 4 minutes. Dalton looked down, then back at her. "Ms. Carter, I had no idea. But may I ask why I clean floors, she said, finishing his thought. Because jobs with degrees don't always hire women who look like me. Not when you take a break to raise a child. Not when you didn't go to the right college. Not when you didn't go to the right college. Not when your voice sounds too black. On the phone interview, silence fell over the room. Dalton looked at the pages again, unable to hide his surprise. You really made all these? He asked. She nodded. Jalen isn't a fluke. He's not a cheater. He's a scholar. Dalton sat back in his chair, unsure what to say. Danielle stood. I just thought you should know who he really is, before you decide who he isn't. And with that, she turned to leave. Dalton watched her walk to the door. Something twisted inside him, a discomfort he couldn't name, a guilt he hadn't expected. He cleared his throat. Ms. Carter, he called. She turned. He squinted slightly. You're his what? The principal blinked in disbelief. You're his what? The principal's stunned question still hung in the air as Danielle left the office. You're his what? Echoed in her ears, not because of the disbelief in Dalton's voice, but because of the truth she'd finally said aloud. She had spent years hiding behind her mop, swallowing her credentials like they were a secret crime. But now, in that cramped office, with its stiff leather chairs and stale coffee smell, she had stripped the mask off. The janitor, the tutor, the mother. She pushed open the heavy door to the stairwell and leaned against the cool concrete wall. For a moment, she let her eyes close. Her heart beat harder than it had in years. She remembered when she used to sit in offices like Dalton's, not as a staff member but as a student. She'd been a math prodigy once. Scholarships, competition, professors who'd whispered brilliant, as if it were a rare bird landing on their window. Then life happened. No one at Jefferson Hills knew about the degree framed in a box under her bed. A master's in applied mathematics from Howard University. She'd been 2 publications shy of a PhD track when she found out she was pregnant with Jalen. She had smiled at the ultrasound, even as the funding letters stopped coming, even as she traded chalkboards for double shifts at diners. Now, in this gleaming school of polished tiles and clean white boards, she mopped floors as if erasing equations from her own life. No one asked. No one cared. Until Jalen's test. That night in their small 2-bedroom apartment, Jalen sat at the kitchen table hunched over a stack of papers. His pencil scratched fast, neat rows of numbers like soldiers marching. Danielle watched him from the sink, drying her hands on a towel. You finished the practice set already? She asked quietly. Jalen nodded, eyes still down. Yeah, it's easy now. She walked over, scanning his answers. Not one mistake. He had outpaced even her mock exams. She felt a strange mix of pride and dread. Pride because her son was brilliant. Dread because she knew brilliance could be a liability here. You're ready for anything they throw at you, she murmured. Jalen looked up at her finally, his dark eyes unsure. Do you think they'll believe me this time? The question cut through her. They have to, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. At school, Miss Bollinger, the math teacher, sat alone at his desk, after class the next day, flipping through Jalen's completed exam. He frowned deeper with each page. Perfect answers, complex solutions written in tidy, confident handwriting. He'd taught for 20 years, and could count on one hand the number of students, white, Asian or otherwise, who had scored this flawlessly. He whispered to himself, this can't be right. His mind didn't go to extra tutoring. It didn't go to hidden talent. It went to something else, something uglier, shaped by a lifetime of low expectations. He got up and walked to the principal's office. The test clutched like evidence. Meanwhile, Danielle was still at the school. The staff meeting had run late, so she was mopping the main hallway when she overheard 2 teachers near the copy room. Did you see Carter's test? One whispered. Unbelievable, the other muttered. Kids like that don't just do that overnight. Danielle's grip tightened on the mop handle. She kept her back to them, jaw set. It was always kids like that, never kids like him. They didn't know she was there. They didn't know she'd heard every word. Later that evening, the mailman slipped a thick envelope through their door. Jalen opened it, curiosity flickering across his face. Inside was the official score report from the state math assessment. His eyes widened. Mom, he called softly. Danielle came out of the bedroom wiping lotion from her hands. What is it? He handed her the letter. She scanned the results, her pulse quickening. Perfect score. Not just the highest in the school but in the entire district, a number that could change everything. Jalen watched her face. Is that Good? It's more than good, she whispered. It's extraordinary. He smiled for a second. Then it faded. They're going to think I cheated, aren't they? Her breath caught. Why would you say that? Because they always do. The room went still. Danielle set the letter down carefully, like a piece of glass that might break. At Jefferson Hills the next morning, Principal Dalton and Mr. Ballinger sat side by side in his office, the test paper between them, like a crime scene photo. I'm telling you, Ballinger insisted. This isn't normal. I've been teaching 2 decades. No student jumps from average to perfect without something fishy. Dalton frowned. He'd spent a sleepless night replaying Danielle's words. I'm his tutor. He believed her, or wanted to, but the optics were impossible. Let's verify, he said cautiously. Call him in. Quietly. We don't want a scene. Ballinger smirked, as if that settled it. Good. We'll get to the bottom of this. Jalen sat at his desk later that morning, staring out the window. A group of white boys in the next row whispered and snickered. He heard one say, "Bet he stole the answers." Another muttered, "No way, he's that smart." He clenched his pencil but said nothing. His mother had taught him silence was sometimes survival. At lunch the cafeteria buzzed with rumors. Some said he'd hacked the test server. Others claimed his mom fed him answers. He moved through the line like a ghost, tray trembling slightly in his hands. No one sat with him. That afternoon, Danielle was summoned to the office again. She walked in still wearing her cleaning apron, face calm but eyes burning. Dalton and Ballinger sat across from her. Jalen sat between them, shoulders hunched. "Ms. Carter," Dalton began, "we need to discuss your son's test." Danielle looked at Jalen, then back at Dalton. "What about it?" Ballinger slid the paper toward her. "This is highly irregular. We need to ensure academic integrity." Danielle's jaw tightened. "Are you accusing my son of cheating?" "No one's accusing," Dalton said quickly. "We're just clarifying." Her voice sharpened. "Clarify what?" "That a black boy couldn't possibly outperform your expectations. That my son can't be brilliant unless he's dishonest." Ballinger's face flushed. "That's not what we're saying." "That's exactly what you're saying," she cut in, her tone still measured but deadly precise. Jalen looked down, shame and rage warring inside him. He wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Dalton cleared his throat. "We'll be conducting a review. Standard procedure." Danielle stood slowly, her presence filling the room despite her uniform. "Review all you want," she said softly. "But know this, Jalen Carter didn't cheat. And neither did I." She took her son's hand. "We're done here." They walked out before either man could respond. That evening Danielle sat at the kitchen table staring at the score report while Jalen did his homework silently. The weight of the day pressed on her. She had spent years making herself small, invisible, unthreatening. She'd swallowed her degree, her story, her pride, so Jalen could have a chance. And still they had found a way to doubt him. But this time, she thought, they had underestimated the wrong family. She reached for her phone. Something in her snapped. It was time to stop hiding. Another part of town. Mr. Ballinger typed an email late at night. The subject line read, "Testing irregularities. Carter, Jalen." He hesitated before hitting send, his cursor hovering over the button. He didn't know Danielle's history. He didn't know the folder of evidence sitting on Dalton's desk. He only knew one thing. He couldn't reconcile a janitor's son with a perfect score. He clicked send. The test results came back, and someone accused him of cheating. The email Miss Ballinger sent late at night hit the school like a spark on dry grass. By morning it wasn't just an internal note. It was a whisper passed from staff lounge to copy room, then from teacher to parent. The subject line, "Testing irregularities, Carter Jalen," became a rumor spoken with narrowed eyes and tilted heads. Jalen arrived at school, unaware. He stepped off the bus with his backpack slung low, earbuds in, face calm. But the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Conversations paused as he walked by. Laughter turned into mutters. Even kids he barely knew gave him looks. Curious, suspicious, some even angry. He felt it before he heard it. At his locker, 2 8th graders leaned in, their voices low but cutting. "You hear about him? Cheated on the state test," one whispered. The other smirked. "Figures. Black kids don't test like that." Jalen froze, his fingers tightening around the lock. He didn't look at them, but their words clung to him like static. He'd heard variations of that phrase his whole life, at playgrounds, on field trips, even at summer camps. But something about hearing it now, After all the hours he and his mother had poured into study sessions, burned hotter. He closed his locker slowly, his face blank. Inside, his stomach turned. In the teacher's lounge, Bellinger poured himself coffee, acting like nothing had changed. But his voice carried just enough for others to hear. "I'm just saying," he remarked to a colleague. "This doesn't add up. The boy was average at best last semester. Then suddenly perfect scores? No one improves like that without help." Ms. Ellison, who'd taught at Jefferson for years, frowned. "Or maybe he studied harder. Ever think of that?" Bellinger chuckled. "Hard work only goes so far. Trust me, I've been doing this a long time." Ellison's jaw tightened. "Or maybe you've been looking at the wrong kids the wrong way." Bellinger didn't answer. He sipped his coffee. The remark spread like wildfire. By second period, even students who hadn't known Jalen's name knew the rumor. "Carter's a cheater. His mom gave him the answers. They probably hacked the system." Jalen sat in math class, eyes forward, pencil poised. He could feel Ballinger's gaze on him, like a weight pressing between his shoulder blades. Every question Ballinger asked seemed laced with suspicion. "Jalen," the teacher called suddenly, "can you explain how you solved number 5 on yesterday's homework?" Jalen stood, voice steady despite his racing pulse. He broke the equation down step by step, his logic flawless. The class was silent. Bellinger forced a smile. "Impressive," he said, but his tone dripped with doubt. Jalen sat back down, his hands trembling under the desk. At lunch, Danielle appeared at the school unexpectedly. She had finished her shift early and decided to check on her son. She found him sitting alone at a corner table, untouched tray in front of him. "Jalen," she said softly, sliding into the seat across from him. "What's going on?" He shrugged, staring at his hands. "Nothing." She reached out, covering his hand with hers. "Don't lie to me." He looked up finally. "They think I cheated. All of them. Even Ballinger. They're saying it's impossible I got that score." Her breath caught. "Who told you that?" "Does it matter?" he said bitterly. "They've been looking at me like I'm guilty all day." Danielle closed her eyes for a second, steadying herself. When she opened them, they burned with quiet fire. "You listen to me," she said, her voice low but firm. "You did nothing wrong. Nothing. You hear me?" Jalen nodded, but his eyes still held doubt. Meanwhile, in the principal's office, Dalton was caught in a storm of emails. Parents had started writing in, some outraged at the accusation, others demanding the school protect the integrity of its testing environment. He had forwarded the emails to the district for guidance, but no reply had come yet. He leaned back in his chair, thinking about Danielle's folder. The worksheets. The long nights she'd described. He believed her. He wanted to believe her. But Ballinger's voice was loud, and his words, "This doesn't add up," had already seeded doubt. Dalton rubbed his temples. "This is going to explode," he muttered. By the end of the day, the tension reached a breaking point. Ballinger, no longer content with whispers, addressed the class directly. "Let's talk about academic honesty," he began, pacing at the front. "It's not just about tests, it's about character." His eyes flicked to Jalen. "When someone turns in work far beyond what they've shown before, it raises questions." A few kids snickered. Jalen stared at his desk, his jaw clenched. Bellinger continued, "It's nothing personal, but this school has standards. We will be investigating irregularities." Jalen's cheeks burned. He raised his hand slowly. "Are you accusing me of something?" he asked, his voice quiet but sharp. The class went silent. Bellinger smiled thinly. "I'm saying when results look impossible, they usually are." Jalen stood without realizing it. "I studied. Every night. My mom helped me. That's how I got here." Bellinger tilted his head. "Convenient," he said. A murmur rippled through the class. Jalen's heart pounded so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. He sat down again, staring at his notebook, until the numbers blurred. After school, Danielle met Jalen at the curb. He walked slowly, shoulders heavy. She reached for his backpack, but he shook his head. "They're never going to believe me," he muttered. "They will," she said, but her voice faltered. She decided right then to stop waiting for the school to investigate. It was time to act. That night, Jalen sat on his bed, staring at the ceiling. His phone buzzed with messages. Some supportive, most not. "Cheater. Liar. Your mom gave you the answers." He turned it face down. From the living room, he could hear his mother on the phone. Her voice was low but fierce. "I want a meeting. Tomorrow." with Ballinger and Dalton. My son deserves an apology. Jalen closed his eyes. For the first time he wondered if brilliance was worth the cost. The next morning, Dalton's secretary found an envelope slid under the office door. Inside was a printed screenshot from social media. Jalen's face photoshopped onto a mugshot with the caption, "Test fraud. No sender. No." Dalton stared at it, a pit forming in his stomach. This was no longer just a staff issue. It was becoming a public one. At lunch that day, a small group of kids approached Jalen's table. A boy named Trevor, one of Ballinger's favorites, leaned down. "Hey genius," he sneered. "How much your mom pay for those answers?" Jalen didn't respond. He gripped his fork so hard it bent. Trevor smirked. "That she cleaned the office for the password." The group laughed and walked off. Jalen stared at his tray, his appetite gone. That afternoon, Danielle arrived at the main office. Her uniform still on, eyes unblinking. She had called the meeting, and now she stood outside the door, waiting. Inside, Dalton and Ballinger sat stiffly at the conference table. She entered without waiting to be invited. "This stops now," she said. Dalton gestured for her to sit. "Miss Carter." "No," she said sharply. "You're not investigating. You're accusing. You're branding my son before you've even looked at the evidence." Ballinger shifted uncomfortably. "We're just trying to maintain standards." "Standards?" Danielle cut in. "Or stereotypes?" The room went still. Dalton cleared his throat. "We're simply asking Jalen to come in and explain." "You mean confess?" she snapped. Dalton looked at her, then at Ballinger. "We'll handle this carefully," he said finally. Danielle stood. "You'd better, because my son will not be your scapegoat." She walked out, leaving the door swinging behind her. In the hallway, Jalen sat on a bench, clutching his backpack. He looked up as his mother emerged, her face set like stone. "They're calling you in," she said softly. "Alone." His heart sank. He nodded once, swallowing hard. Jalen was pulled into the office. Alone. The waiting room outside the principal's office felt colder than usual. Danielle Carter sat stiffly on the edge of the vinyl chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles pale. Her janitor's uniform, still slightly damp from the morning's work, clung to her back. She hadn't gone home to change. She hadn't even eaten. Time wasn't the priority. Truth was. Jalen sat beside her, silent, a spiral notebook, clenched in his hands like armor. She reached over and gave his knee a gentle squeeze. He looked up, eyes tired but focused, and nodded. The door creaked open. Dalton's secretary called her name. "They're ready for you." Inside, the conference room looked less like a space for solutions, and more like a courtroom. At the far end sat Principal Dalton, jaw set, eyes unreadable. Beside him were two school board members, Mr. Halverson, a retired attorney with a pensioned scowl, and Ms. Lena Griggs, the only black woman in the district's leadership. Her expression was cautious but reserved. Danielle walked in without hesitation, her boots squeaking faintly on the polished floor. She didn't sit right away. She opened her worn leather bag and pulled out a laptop, a stack of notebooks, and two manila folders bulging with papers. Dalton gestured to the chair. "Miss Carter, please." She sat, eyes scanning each face with careful precision. Griggs folded her hands. "We appreciate you coming in on such short notice." Danielle nodded. "This isn't short notice. This has been building for years." There was a pause. Dalton cleared his throat. "We want to get clarity regarding your son's recent test performance and the accusations raised by his instructor." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "Accusations," she echoed. "So, we're skipping the part where we consider the possibility that he's just smart." "No one's ruling that out," Halverson said, adjusting his glasses. "But this situation requires thorough review. Academic integrity is not just about protecting test scores," Danielle cut in. "It's also about not letting bias dictate who we assume is capable." She opened the laptop and spun it toward them. "I've documented every tutoring session Jalen and I have done over the past 2 years. Times, dates, topics, even recordings." She clicked a folder labeled Jalen's Progress. The screen filled with rows of videos, spreadsheets, practice quizzes, scanned worksheets with red-circled corrections, and charts showing his score improvements week by week. Griggs leaned forward. Danielle clicked on a video. In it, Jalen sat at their small kitchen table, working through a multi-step calculus problem, as Danielle guided him gently through each stage. Her voice was calm, His answers quick and confident. The timestamp read 11:46 p.m. on a school night. Another video showed them working on a mock state exam. Another featured Danielle creating her own rubric to grade his essays. Every evening. Sometimes for hours, Danielle said. After my shift. After dinner. After laundry. This is what we do. Halverson blinked, clearly surprised. Dalton shifted in his seat, less comfortable. Danielle pulled out one of the folders and passed it down the table. These are the worksheets I created. Problems based on state standards, broken down by difficulty level. I wrote every one of them myself. Griggs flipped through the pages, her eyebrows rising slightly. You wrote these? Halverson asked, skepticism creeping in. I have a master's in mathematics from Howard University, she replied without hesitation. I'm not just his mother, I'm his educator. Dalton tapped his pen. If that's true, why haven't you applied for teaching jobs here, she finished. I did, twice, never got a call back. Griggs looked down. Danielle leaned in. So I took what I had, my son, and I poured into him everything I was denied. Another silence settled like fog. You think a kid like Jalen doesn't belong at the top of your scoreboards because you've never imagined a world where black excellence isn't suspicious? Halverson leaned back. Miss Carter, no one here is denying your hard work. But you must understand. I understand exactly what's happening, she said, her voice low, firm. My son succeeded, and instead of celebrating him, you're dissecting him. Dalton looked uneasy. This isn't personal. It's always personal when it's your child, she replied. Griggs finally spoke. Do you mind if we keep this data for review? You can keep it. I'll email you the backups too. Just don't pretend you didn't see it. Danielle stood. Because I'm not gonna let you fail him just because you failed to see him. She packed up slowly, deliberately. Then she turned to Dalton. You've seen the truth now. It's on you what you do with it. She walked out, not waiting for permission. Outside, Jalen looked up as the door opened. He stood, nervous. Danielle gave him a tired smile and nodded. You did nothing wrong, she reminded him. I know, he said, but it came out softer than he meant. They left together, mother and son, past rows of framed photos of student athletes and valedictorians, none of whom looked like Jalen. Inside, the silence lingered. Dalton tapped his pen absently. Thoughts? Halverson leaned forward. We'll need to verify the materials. That's standard. Griggs looked up slowly. You believe her, don't you? Dalton hesitated. I don't think she's lying. But that doesn't change public perception. Parents are asking questions. Teachers are watching. Halverson nodded. We'll need to demonstrate procedural fairness. Dalton frowned. What do you suggest? Halverson's voice was quiet. Disciplinary hearing. Griggs stiffened. For what offense? Testing irregularities. Suspicion of misconduct. We're not saying he did cheat, but we need to show we take the process seriously. Dalton didn't answer. Griggs leaned in. Be careful. If this backfires, we're not just talking about one student. We're talking about every student like him. That evening, Danielle sat at the kitchen table, staring at her laptop. She felt hollow. She had handed them everything. Her work, her son's truth, their sacrifices. Jalen walked in, eyes rimmed with fatigue. He hesitated in the doorway. What happens next, he asked. Danielle looked up, unsure how to answer. Then her phone buzzed. A new email. Subject: notice of disciplinary hearing. Jalen Carter. The school board called for a disciplinary hearing. They scheduled the disciplinary hearing on a Tuesday morning, quietly, and with little notice. The email came late Sunday evening, buried beneath school announcements and logistical jargon. Danielle read it 3 times before the words fully sank in. Attendance mandatory. Allegations of academic dishonesty will be reviewed before a select panel of educators and board officials. It didn't say accused. It didn't say innocent, until proven. It said reviewed, as if they'd already made up their minds. Danielle woke Jalen early that day. They sat side by side on the bus ride to school. Not speaking, just breathing in sync. He wore the only collared shirt he owned. She wore a navy blazer, borrowed from her neighbor. The sleeves were short on her arms, but she wore it like armor. As they approached the administrative wing, the hallway was unusually crowded. Teachers, staff, even a few students peeked from behind lockers and open classroom doors. By the time they entered the hearing room, it was clear this wasn't a small procedural meeting. It was a spectacle. The room had been rearranged. A long table stretched across the front where Dalton, Ballinger, and 2 other board members sat. To the left, 3 empty chairs for the accused and parent. Behind them, rows of seats filled with PTA mothers, teachers in cardigans, a few local reporters, and a scattering of school staff. Almost all of them were white. Danielle scanned the crowd. No one made eye contact. A legal advisor, white and expressionless, welcomed them with a clipboard and procedural notes. Jalen sat beside his mother, legs stiff, hands folded tightly on his lap. No one told him how to speak, or when, or if. Dalton opened the hearing with rehearsed formality. We are gathered to determine the validity of recent test performance submitted by student Jalen Carter. This is not a criminal proceeding, but an inquiry into the academic integrity policies of Jefferson Hills. Danielle raised her hand gently. Will Jalen be allowed to speak for himself? Dalton didn't answer immediately. He glanced at Ballinger. When appropriate, he finally said. Let's begin. The first to speak was Ballinger. He stood with a folder in hand and launched into a timeline of Jalen's academic record. He read test scores aloud, numbers meant to sound inconsistent. Last year's B average, the C in algebra, and now a perfect score. As an educator with over 20 years of experience, he said, I find this leap statistically improbable. Danielle shifted in her seat. Her hand touched Jalen's shoulder, a quiet signal of strength. Ballinger continued, holding up a printed copy of Jalen's test. These answers weren't just correct, they were perfect. No erasure marks, no hesitation, full points on every extended response. In my professional opinion, this isn't typical performance. He sat down, looking satisfied. Next came 2 teachers who had worked closely with Jalen. Neither had taught him math. One mentioned he was quiet, often withdrawn. Another described him as polite, but not academically exceptional. A third, a PE teacher, added that Jalen had once missed a push-up requirement in gym class. None of it had anything to do with testing. But each comment painted a picture, one in which Jalen didn't belong at the top. Danielle waited her turn. When she finally stood to speak, she adjusted the borrowed blazer and cleared her throat. My name is Danielle Carter. I am Jalen's mother, and I am the person who helped him prepare for that exam. A few parents in the crowd shifted in their seats. She pulled a USB drive from her bag. This contains video logs of every tutoring session, every worksheet, every mock exam, dated, time-stamped. Dalton motioned for a tech assistant to take the drive. Danielle continued. Jalen's growth wasn't sudden. It was earned. Over 2 years, after my shifts, on weekends, while other kids were playing video games. She paused. But you didn't ask about that. Someone coughed loudly. Ballinger leaned back, arms crossed. Danielle opened a folder and held up Jalen's practice scores. His scores increased steadily, because he worked, not because he cheated. She looked directly at the panel. If he were white, if he were Trevor Myers or Logan Whitley, you'd be giving him an award. A low murmur rose from the audience. Halverson spoke up. Ms. Carter, please keep comments focused on the case. I am, she interrupted. This is the case. The fact that you're more comfortable with the idea of him being a fraud than being brilliant. That is the case. Griggs didn't speak, but her eyes held something close to shame. Jalen was asked to respond next. He stood slowly, his voice quiet. I studied every night. I didn't cheat. I didn't even know I did the best in the district until the score came. A board member leaned forward. If you're innocent, why didn't you volunteer your study logs earlier? Jalen looked down. I didn't think I'd need to prove it. Another board member scribbled something on paper. Someone in the audience muttered. Sounds rehearsed. Jalen heard it. His face didn't change, but inside something cracked. Dalton cleared his throat. Let's review the test in question. A projection screen lit up behind him. Jalen's scanned answer sheet appeared. Clean, symmetrical, every line in place. The room went still. Halverson gestured to a math consultant, seated beside the board. Your thoughts? The consultant hesitated. It's highly advanced. I've seen similar work from gifted programs. But it is rare. Rare enough to be suspicious? Ballinger asked pointedly. The consultant looked uncomfortable. Unusual. Not impossible. Danielle stood again. You're trying to criminalize perfection. Because it came from a boy you already dismissed. Another parent in the crowd, a PTA mother with pearls, raised her hand. I don't mean to offend, she said, already offensive. But do we really think a janitor's son jumped to #1 without some kind of help? Gasps. A few chuckles. Griggs sat up straight, finally finding her voice. That is entirely inappropriate. Danielle looked directly at the woman. Help? Yes. From me. His mother. His tutor. His believer. The room grew still again. But it was too late. The hearing wasn't about truth. It was about control. By the end, the decision was brief. Dalton folded his hands and read aloud, as if it were routine. Due to unresolved testing irregularities and concerns regarding academic authenticity, Jalen Carter will be suspended for 1 week. During this time, he is to refrain from attending classes or participating in school activities. Further review pending. Danielle inhaled sharply. Suspended? Jalen's mouth fell open. But there's no proof, Danielle shouted. No evidence. You saw everything. Dalton didn't meet her eyes. Halverson simply said, the integrity of the institution must be preserved. Outside, the hallway was lined with teachers and students pretending not to eavesdrop. Danielle walked out with Jalen beside her, her face unreadable. He spoke first. So that's it? She nodded once. For now, but her eyes, cold and burning, said otherwise. Jalen was suspended for testing irregularities. The hallways of Jefferson Hills felt colder the day after Jalen's suspension. His locker sat unopened. The space he once occupied in math class was filled with silence. The tension in the air wasn't spoken. It was felt. Teachers walked past it, unsure of what to say. Students whispered, but no one said his name aloud. Not because they forgot, but because they knew. Jalen Carter had disappeared. Not just from the building, from the school's narrative. Danielle stood outside that morning, arms crossed, coat zipped up high against the morning chill. She wasn't holding a mop. She wasn't wearing her uniform. And for the first time, she wasn't trying to blend in. She had printed a simple sign and stood in silence at the school entrance. My son didn't cheat. Your system failed. It didn't take long before people noticed. Some teachers walked past without acknowledgement. Others gave tight-lipped nods. Parents dropped their kids off and avoided eye contact. But someone, a student, took a photo. And that's when everything began to change. That afternoon, Danielle sat at her kitchen table, the same one where Jalen used to study, scrolling through her phone. The photo had spread quickly on local forums. But what made it viral was what happened next. Danielle hadn't planned to speak. But when a young black teacher, Ms. Ellison, walked out of the building during her lunch break and asked, "Do you want me to film you?" She didn't hesitate. She took a breath, faced the phone, and let years of exhaustion and clarity pour out. My son isn't suspended because he cheated. He's suspended because he succeeded where he wasn't expected to. He studied harder than most adults work. He worked past midnight while I cleaned this very building. And the reward he got wasn't a trophy or recognition. It was death. Racism doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers through policy and hides behind phrases like unusual performance. I know what's going on, and I won't be quiet. The video hit social media within an hour. By midnight, it had nearly 800,000 views. The next morning, Danielle's phone rang nonstop. Friends, strangers, activists, journalists. She turned down every request except one from a small local radio station, run by a community advocate named Rosa Jennings. That evening, she sat in Rosa's modest studio, the soundproof walls making her nerves feel louder. Tell them the truth, Rosa said gently, as the red light blinked on. Danielle leaned into the mic. This isn't just about my son. This is about every black student who's ever been questioned more than congratulated. This is about the kind of suspicion that's reserved for our excellence. This is about how systems silence you, unless you make enough noise. And noise she made. Within 2 days, Jefferson Hills found itself at the center of a growing firestorm. The video had crossed state lines. Educators from other districts began sharing stories of similar irregularities. Black students across the country posted using the hashtag seen but not heard. Meanwhile, the school board released a short, cautious statement. We take all academic concerns seriously and are conducting ongoing evaluations. We encourage the community to trust the process, but no one was trusting the process anymore, especially not Danielle. Jalen remained home. The silence in their apartment was new. He didn't ask about the videos, didn't mention the headlines. He simply stayed in his room, headphones on, sketching formulas in his notebook. Danielle knocked on his door one night. You want to talk? She asked softly. He looked up. Does it matter? It matters to me. Jalen set his pencil down. Why do they hate us so much for just trying? Danielle sat beside him, on the bed. Because if they admit how hard we've worked, they have to admit how much they've ignored us. Jalen didn't respond. He just leaned into her shoulder. Outside the school, things had changed. Quietly, at first. A few parents began asking questions at board meetings. A couple of teachers, including Ms. Ellison, spoke in hushed voices about reviewing their curriculum. One even apologized to Danielle in the parking lot. I didn't realize how deep it went. But just as the movement swelled, so did the backlash. A second video surfaced, this one anonymous, accusing Danielle of weaponizing race. It claimed she was setting a dangerous precedent by attacking teachers and undermining authority. It ended with a chilling phrase, "Some parents think this needs to stop." Danielle watched the video once. Then again. And again. She didn't flinch. But her stomach turned. The next day she returned to work. She hadn't planned to. But cleaning gave her clarity. The mop in her hand was the same. But she wasn't. As she unlocked the janitor's closet, something unusual caught her eye. Her locker was ajar. She stepped closer. A small envelope sat inside. No name, no return address. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed. Cold. Stay quiet. Stay in your place, or next time it won't just be your job. An anonymous letter showed up in her locker. Danielle stared at the anonymous letter in her hands, the words sinking like stone. Stay quiet. Stay in your place. Or next time, it won't just be your job. There was no signature, no return address, just white paper, black ink, and centuries of silence whispering through its tone. She folded it carefully, slid it into her bag, and locked her locker again. She didn't flinch. Not here, not now, but her hands trembled as she wiped down the cafeteria tables later that morning. Each pass of the rag was slower than the last, each whisper behind her back more loaded than usual. When the second letter came 2 days later, it wasn't inside her locker. It was taped to the janitor's cart. You had your 15 minutes. Now go back to cleaning. This time, the message was written in red marker. Large, angry letters. Jagged edges. Like someone had pressed too hard. Like hate had weight. Danielle peeled it off calmly, folded it into quarters, and placed it next to the first. Jalen hadn't returned to school yet. His suspension was still in effect, and Danielle had decided not to rush the process. But when he came to school briefly to clean out his locker on Friday morning, the damage was already done. Someone had written across his locker in thick black Sharpie, "Cheater, liar, fraud." Underneath, another line in smaller letters read, "Black kids don't belong in honors." Jalen froze. Danielle, walking just behind him, stopped short. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Danielle reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and snapped a picture. She didn't say a word, but something shifted in Jalen's expression. Less hurt this time. More resolve. Later that evening, the third letter arrived. This one was mailed to their apartment. It had no return address, but the handwriting on the envelope was neat. Like someone had taken their time. Inside, "If you really cared about your son, you'd stop ruining things for the rest of us." Danielle folded it slower than the others, then placed it on the table beside her laptop. Jalen was seated at the far end of the couch, silent. He'd seen her open it, and now his voice broke through the tension. "They're scared," he said softly. Danielle looked up. "They're scared of what happens if someone like me actually gets ahead." She nodded. "And they're angry that you didn't ask permission first." Jalen didn't answer. He just looked back down at the same page of math problems he'd been staring at for half an hour. The pencil in his hand hadn't moved. The next morning, Danielle walked into Dalton's office with the 3 letters in a manila envelope. She placed them on his desk, one by one, without speaking. Dalton looked pale. He opened them slowly, reading each note in full silence. "This is serious," he murmured. "It's criminal," Danielle corrected. "I'll speak to security," he offered. "We'll increase monitoring, install more cameras." "You should have done that before," she snapped. "My son was harassed, humiliated, and suspended, and now we're being threatened. And you still haven't apologized." Dalton rubbed his temple. "I understand how emotional this is. Don't patronize me," she said, voice like steel. "What you don't understand is how dangerous it is to make a black child a target and then leave him exposed." Meanwhile, Bollinger had returned to his usual classroom routine, or at least he tried to. But the pressure was building. He noticed more students looking at him differently. One parent requested their child be removed from his class. Another posted on Facebook about racially biased teachers at Jefferson. He felt the temperature rising, and it made him defensive. So when Danielle formally requested that Jalen return to his class once the suspension ended, Ballinger refused. He sent a short email. "I do not believe I can provide an unbiased educational environment for this student moving forward." Danielle read it 3 times, then without hesitation, forwarded it to the school board. The 4th letter arrived on a Sunday night. No envelope this time. It had been slid under their front door. "You think this ends with a hashtag? You're making enemies you can't see. Watch your back." Danielle stood in the hallway, staring down at it while Jalen slept in the next room. She picked it up, folded it, and placed it with the others, but this time her hands shook longer. She wasn't afraid for herself. She was afraid for her son. For the message it sent to every child watching. That excellence came at a cost, and that cost might be safety. The following morning, she filed a police report. The officer at the desk, a young white man, listened politely, but said what she expected to hear. "There's not much we can do unless there's a direct threat." Danielle pulled out the latest letter. He read it, scratched his head. "It's vague. I mean, watch your back could mean a lot of things." Danielle's eyes narrowed. "Would you say the same if it was sent to a white student? Or a teacher?" The officer didn't answer. She left the station with a copy of the report, and no real assurance. By Wednesday, the school board had received her formal complaint. In it, she outlined every incident. The suspension without evidence. The refusal to reinstate Jalen. The racist graffiti. The teacher's refusal to allow re-entry. The hate letters. The district's failure to protect her son. Attached were time-stamped photos, audio recordings of hostile remarks, and copies of every letter. She ended the document with one line. "My son is not your scapegoat. He is your mirror, and you're afraid of what you see." 2 days later, an unexpected email landed in Dalton's inbox. Subject: Internal Facilities. Camera Review. Request for authorization. It was from a security contractor hired months earlier to upgrade the school's surveillance. Apparently, during a routine review of hallway footage, something flagged in the algorithm: unusual behavior near janitorial locker area. Danielle wasn't told. Dalton wasn't expecting it. But the footage was about to change everything. A new set of surveillance footage surfaced. Principal Dalton sat at his desk, the office silent except for the soft hum of his monitor. The security footage had just finished playing. He leaned forward slowly, replaying the final moments. Jalen Carter sat alone in the testing room. No notes, no phone, no glances at another student. He worked with calm precision, turning page after page, his pencil moving steadily. At the 43-minute mark, he closed his booklet, checked his answers, and raised his hand. The proctor approached. Jalen stood, handed in his exam, and walked out. There was nothing suspicious. No communication with anyone. No signals. No hesitation. Just a quiet, focused kid, doing what he'd been trained to do. Dalton sat back in his chair, eyes distant. He couldn't deny what he'd seen, but he also didn't know what to do with it. An hour later, Danielle was called into the front office. She had just finished mopping the lower gym hallway when the secretary waved her down with a clipped "Principal wants to see you." She didn't flinch. Inside Dalton's office, he gestured toward a seat. She didn't take it. Instead, she dropped her gloves on the edge of the desk. "What now?" Dalton looked tired. "We reviewed new surveillance footage from the testing day." Danielle crossed her arms. He hesitated. "Jalen took the test alone. Start to finish. No signs of misconduct." "So you're clearing his name?" she asked. Dalton rubbed his temples. "We're reviewing it with the district's academic integrity board." Danielle's jaw tightened. "You have video proof. What more do you need?" "It's not that simple," Dalton replied, eyes flickering. "Policy requires multiple forms of validation, and we need to assess how this reflects on broader procedures." Danielle blinked. "So the truth's on camera, but you're still reviewing?" He leaned forward. "You have to understand, this isn't just about one student. It's about precedent." Danielle's voice dropped. "You're worried about setting a precedent for black brilliance. That's what this is." Dalton didn't respond. She turned to leave, pausing at the door. "You were looking for evidence of cheating. You found evidence of excellence, and you still couldn't say it. The footage should have cleared everything, but instead it disappeared into bureaucracy. Emails circulated between board members. Lawyers whispered about data retention standards. Teachers continued to avoid Jalen's name. The school released no official statement. The graffiti on his locker remained uncleaned. Even with the truth documented and timestamped, the system stalled. And that was the point. Because racism doesn't always come in slurs or hate mail. Sometimes, it's a delay, a deflection, a missing email, a voice that says, "We're still evaluating," when the answer's already clear. Danielle didn't go to the press immediately. Instead, she went home. She sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop. The file from Dalton was there. The footage, downloaded in full resolution. She watched it again, and again, until her eyes blurred. Then she opened another browser tab and typed in one phrase. Civil Rights Education Attorney Atlanta. She found one name repeated across articles. Carmen DeWitt. A woman known for taking on public schools, for filing Title VI lawsuits under federal anti-discrimination law, and for winning. Danielle stared at the contact form for 5 minutes before she filled it out. She didn't use legal terms, just plain truth. My son was suspended after acing a test. We have video proof of his innocence. They still won't reinstate him. They doubt him because he's black. I'm his mother, and I won't let them bury this. The next morning, Danielle got a call. Carmen's voice was sharp, but warm. I saw the video. I read the complaint. If you're ready to fight this, I'm ready to represent you. Danielle felt her chest tighten. What's our next step? You're going to walk into that school, Carmen said, and let them know they've got 72 hours to reinstate Jalen, or we file a federal civil rights lawsuit under Title VI. Danielle closed her eyes. And if they don't, then we expose them. And I promise you, this time they'll have to listen. Jalen sat on the living room floor that evening, textbook open, still doing math. Danielle placed a hand on his shoulder. They're going to hear you now, she said. Jalen didn't speak for a moment. Then he looked up. Even if they don't want to, she nodded. Especially then. At Jefferson Hills, Dalton received the formal letter from Carmen 2 days later. It was sharp, clear, and unmistakably legal. The subject line, Notice of Intent to File Civil Rights Complaint, Carter Jalen. It outlined a timeline. The footage, the racial disparity, the retaliation. It included a demand for full reinstatement, expungement of all disciplinary records, and a formal apology issued publicly. Dalton called an emergency board meeting that afternoon. Bellinger sat in the corner, arms crossed. We have to stand firm, he insisted. If we cave, it sets a dangerous precedent. Griggs, silent for most of the meeting, finally leaned forward. The only precedent we're setting now is that black students are guilty until proven impossible. Halverson's voice was tense. They have the footage. They have a lawyer. This isn't going away. Bellinger raised his voice. It's about academic standards. No. Griggs cut in. It's about your comfort, not standards. Dalton looked at the room, then down at the letter. Then back up. We have 3 days. That night, Danielle received an anonymous email. No subject line. No message. Just a video attachment. Curious. She downloaded it. It was grainy. Security footage from the janitor's hallway. Not from testing day, but from a week earlier. It showed a man in a white shirt walking toward her locker. He glanced over his shoulder, then slipped a piece of paper inside. She recognized him immediately. Mr. Bellinger. She filed a civil rights lawsuit. The envelope Danielle had received days earlier sat in the center of the kitchen table, unopened now but still burning in her mind. The grainy footage of Bellinger at her locker replayed in her head over and over, each frame like a hammer hitting the same nail. It was never just about Jalen's test anymore. It was about the pattern, the slow erosion of dignity through whispers, policies, and reviews. Danielle had spent her adult life cleaning up other people's messes. Now, for the first time, she was ready to make one of her own. She picked up the phone and called Carmen DeWitt. I'm done waiting, Danielle said. Carmen's voice was steady, unflinching. Then we move. We file. The civil rights lawsuit went public the following Monday. Carter v. Jefferson Hills School District. The complaint named not only the district but specific administrators, including Bellinger and Halverson, for discriminatory practices. It cited the video footage of Jalen's test, the hate letters, the refusal to reinstate him, and the racially loaded comments at the disciplinary hearing. But Carmen didn't stop there. She dug deeper. Her legal team requested 5 years of district disciplinary records under the state's Open Records Act. Within 2 weeks, boxes of files arrived at her downtown office. Danielle helped unpack them. Jalen sat quietly at a corner table, doing math while lawyers flipped through statistics. What they found wasn't just bad, it was devastating. Black students at Jefferson Hills were suspended at 5 times the rate of white students for the same infractions. Black students were twice as likely to be placed in remedial classes after a single low test score. Teacher evaluations for black boys included coded words: disruptive, defensive, unmotivated, at rates disproportionate to their white peers. The data didn't whisper. It screamed. Carmen leaned over the table one evening, highlighter in hand. "This isn't a lawsuit anymore," she said. "It's an indictment of an entire system." Danielle's hands shook as she flipped through a chart of suspension rates. "They've been doing this for years," she murmured. Carmen nodded. "And now we have proof." News outlets began circling before the first hearing even took place. Local reporters parked outside Danielle's apartment, cameras waiting for a glimpse. A national education blog posted an article titled, "Suspended for Being Brilliant," the story of Jalen Carter. Then a cable news network picked it up. By the third week, Danielle's phone buzzed with interview requests. Some genuine, some exploitative. She turned most down but agreed to one long-form feature in a Sunday newspaper. The headline the following week was simple but brutal. "A perfect score. A perfect storm." The district scrambled. Halverson sent out internal memos reminding staff not to engage with media and to protect the school's reputation. Dalton held emergency meetings with legal counsel. Bellinger refused to comment publicly, but inside the school, he walked the halls like a man surrounded by ghosts. Teachers whispered about new sensitivity training modules. Emailed from the district office. Some rolled their eyes. Others looked uneasy. Ms. Ellison, however, printed out the article and pinned it inside her classroom closet. She told no one, but something inside her had shifted. Meanwhile, Jalen remained at home. His suspension over but his reinstatement delayed pending review. The district offered to place him in another classroom, but Danielle refused. He deserves to go back where he was. On his terms. Each day Jalen grew quieter, but his eyes sharper. He was learning something Danielle hadn't meant to teach him, that the truth alone was not enough. One evening, as he sat at the kitchen table, he asked, "Why do we have to fight so hard just to be believed?" Danielle put down her coffee mug. "Because they built it that way, and because they're afraid of what happens if we stop fighting." He nodded, but his shoulders stayed slumped. The first court filing rattled the district's facade. Carmen's team attached dozens of exhibits, time-stamped footage, copies of hate mail, and the demographic data they had unearthed. The narrative was no longer about one irregular test. It was about a culture of bias. The district's attorneys filed a motion to dismiss. It failed. The case moved forward. By now, the hashtag Jalen Carter had become a rallying cry. Students from neighboring schools staged walkouts holding signs, "Smart is not suspicious," and "Black excellence isn't cheating." An op-ed in a major paper titled, "When Schools Punish Potential" went viral. Danielle didn't expect support from everyone, and she didn't get it. Anonymous messages still flooded her inbox. Some called her an opportunist. Others claimed she was using race as a weapon. One particularly vile message said, "You're ruining good teachers for your 15 minutes." She forwarded them all to Carmen. Carmen told her, "Every hate message you get is proof of why this case matters." Danielle saved them in a folder named simply, "Evidence." Inside Jefferson Hills, the tension was almost unbearable. Parents had started questioning Ballinger at pickup. A teacher resigned unexpectedly, citing ethical concerns. Griggs began distancing herself from the board, quietly providing Carmen's team with internal policy manuals. And yet official statements from the district remained carefully neutral, full of phrases like "ongoing review" and "upholding standards." Danielle could see the strategy stall, deflect, drain her energy. But she didn't bend. The first pre-hearing press conference took place on the courthouse steps downtown. Carmen stood at the podium, Danielle beside her. Jalen slightly behind. Microphones jutted forward like spears. Carmen spoke clearly. "This isn't just about one boy's test. This is about a system that punishes black excellence and rewards white mediocrity. This is about a district that looked at proof of brilliance and called it inconclusive. We are here because they left us no choice." Danielle took the microphone next. Her voice was steady but heavy. "I cleaned that school for 4 years. I poured everything into my son. I showed them the evidence. And still they called him a liar. I won't stop until they admit what they've done." Not just to him but to every child like him. Jalen didn't speak, but the cameras caught his face. Solemn, intelligent, defiant. The clip aired on national news that night. Inside his classroom the next day, Bellinger watched the segment alone. He muted the TV, but stared at the captions as they scrolled across the screen. He wasn't sleeping well. He'd stopped eating lunch in the teacher's lounge. Parents were starting to pull their kids from his class. His inbox was filling with complaints and insults alike. He told himself he was the victim of a witch hunt. But deep down, something else festered, a memory he'd buried. Carmen's legal team kept digging. One paralegal found an email from 2 years earlier, in which administrators had told teachers to flag any suspicious test performance by high-risk demographics. Another uncovered training slides, subtly suggesting extra vigilance for disproportionate improvements in certain student populations. Carmen printed the slides out and handed them to Danielle. "This is your smoking gun." Danielle stared at the paper. They put it in writing. By the 3rd week of the case, Jefferson Hills was bleeding reputation. Enrollment inquiries dropped. Alumni threatened to pull donations. The state's education board announced an informal review of district practices. Yet inside the district office, Bellinger grew quieter. He spent hours in his classroom after the bell rang, sitting at his desk, staring at nothing. Something had shifted. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Miss Ellison walked into Carmen's office unannounced. She carried a folder under her arm. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed it on the table. "I've seen too much," she said, "and I can't keep my mouth shut anymore." Carmen leaned forward. "What is it?" Ellison swallowed hard. "I know things about Bellinger, about what he was told to do, about who told him to do it." Danielle, sitting in the corner, looked up sharply. "Are you willing to go on record?" Carmen asked. Ellison's eyes flicked between them. "I don't know yet, but I can't keep living with this." She pushed the folder closer. Inside were memos, emails, training materials, notes of meetings. Danielle's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "What's in there?" she whispered. Ellison took a shaky breath. "Proof. And a confession." A local teacher came forward with a confession. For 14 years, Ms. Laurel Ellison had played the game. She had taught 7th grade English at Jefferson Hills long enough to know when to speak, when to smile, and when to say nothing. She was one of the few black teachers at the school, and the only one with tenure. It gave her a kind of invisible armor. Not full protection, but enough to survive. But over the years she'd seen too much. Black boys held to higher discipline standards. Black girls labeled loud when they advocated for themselves. Honors classes overwhelmingly white. And a pattern in staff meetings that no one ever said aloud, but everyone followed. So when Jalen Carter's case exploded into the public, it didn't shock her. It haunted her. Because she remembered the meeting where it all began. The folder she handed to Carmen DeWitt was thick. Inside were printed emails from the assistant principal dating back 5 years. Bullet points from data meetings that emphasized monitoring academic outliers, especially in high-risk demographics. There were notes from in-service teacher trainings that instructed educators to be extra vigilant when reviewing unusually high test scores from students flagged under Tier 2 monitoring. A phrase Carmen's team would later prove correlated strongly with race and income. Carmen flipped through the pages, her expression shifting from focused to furious.
"This is a policy,"
she muttered. "This isn't bias, it's written instruction." Danielle sat still, listening. Miss Ellison exhaled. "They never said black students out loud, but we all knew who they meant." Later that night, Carmen invited Miss Ellison to her office for a recorded deposition. The camera was small and discreet. The room was quiet except for the occasional hum of traffic from the street below. Mrs. Ellison sat upright, her fingers folded in her lap. She spoke slowly at first, as if each sentence cost her something. "In 2019, she began, "we were given a directive during professional development to watch for suspicious improvements in performance." The phrase was repeated at least 3 times, and though it wasn't said explicitly, the examples they gave, all of them, were black students. She paused. The implication was clear. If a white student suddenly improved, it was hard work. If a black student improved, it was cause for review. Carmen leaned in. "Did anyone object?" Ms. Ellison looked away. No one wanted to be the one, not even me. Her confession sparked something that legal briefs and statistics couldn't: outrage. Carmen's team released a redacted version of the video online. Within 24 hours it had been viewed 1.3 million times. The headline from a major investigative outlet read, "Teacher breaks silence, told to monitor black test scores closely." The reaction was immediate. Students across the state staged coordinated walkouts. Educators held forums discussing implicit bias in standardized testing. A civil rights organization launched a petition demanding that the Jefferson Hills School Board resign. And still inside the district office, silence. Danielle watched the news unfold from her apartment, arms crossed, phone buzzing with notifications. She didn't feel vindicated. Not yet. She felt tired. But she wasn't done. Ms. Ellison faced backlash almost instantly. An anonymous parent posted her personal phone number online. She received voicemails calling her a traitor, a liar, and worse. Someone mailed her a picture of her own house with no message. The principal called her in privately. "You're creating chaos," he said. "No," she replied. "I'm revealing it." He warned her she was risking her position. She stared back. "I've been risking it for 14 years. You just never noticed." Jalen, still home, saw the headlines too. He watched Miss Ellison's video 3 times. Headphones in. Alone in his room. When he emerged from the room later, he said just one sentence to his mother. "She told the truth." Danielle nodded. "Yes. And now we fight louder." That same week, Carmen's legal team subpoenaed 2 former district staff members who had resigned in previous years, both black, both teachers. They agreed to speak. One shared internal emails in which he had been reprimanded for over-identifying black students for honors placements. Another revealed he was pushed out after advocating for racial equity training. The case against Jefferson Hills was no longer about Jalen. It was about the dozens, maybe hundreds of other students who had been pushed down so others could stay comfortable. Inside the district boardroom, the walls were closing in. Dalton sat with his head in his hands. Bollinger, who had avoided interviews, now found himself facing internal review. Griggs, who had once been a quiet observer, now spoke at length to the press about her discomfort with board decisions. Halverson looked like a man unraveling. "We need to contain this," he told the board. "We're losing control." Griggs stood. "No, Halverson. You already lost it. You just didn't realize it, because the kids you silenced weren't loud enough." 3 days after Ms. Ellison's video went viral, the district's inbox crashed from the volume of email. Parents demanded answers. Teachers from other schools voiced support for Danielle and Jalen. One student wrote, "I was put in remedial reading in 6th grade, even though I scored higher than my friend who is white. Her parents were called in for a gifted evaluation. Mine weren't even notified. I never forgot that." Stories poured in. The system that had been so carefully guarded now leaked at the seams. Danielle returned to Jefferson Hills for the first time since filing the lawsuit. She didn't wear her janitor's uniform. She wore a suit, her first in years. She walked through the front doors, not to clean, but to attend a scheduled meeting with district council. As she passed the front office, a secretary looked up and said, "They're expecting you." Danielle smiled. "Good. They should be." At the same time, inside a private room just down the hall, the school board sat around a long table. The room was quiet, the air thick. Dalton looked at the others. "The pressure's mounting. We have to act." Halverson clenched his jaw. "This isn't just PR anymore. It's liability." Griggs stared them down. "Then maybe it's time we stop protecting ourselves and start protecting the kids we failed." Someone knocked. A staffer handed Dalton a sheet of paper. He read it silently, then placed it on the table. It was a formal notice from the state's Department of Education. They were launching a formal compliance audit of Jefferson Hills School District. An hour later, the board issued a statement. "In light of recent developments and growing community concern, Jefferson Hills School Board has called for an emergency session to review district-wide academic practices and administrative conduct." It was the district's first public acknowledgement that something was deeply wrong. Danielle read the statement at her kitchen table. Jalen sat beside her, silent. She exhaled. "They're cracking," she said. Finally, Jalen looked up. "Does this mean I can go back?" Danielle didn't answer. "Not yet." The school board announced an emergency meeting. The morning after the school board's emergency meeting was announced, the sidewalk in front of Jefferson Hills wasn't quiet anymore. The usual line of SUVs idling for drop-off was replaced with picket signs, bullhorns, and voices that no longer asked for justice. They demanded it. By 9 a.m., over 200 people had gathered outside the school gates. Parents, students, former teachers, local pastors, Civil rights groups, college students from nearby campuses, reporters with cameras slung over their shoulders, social media influencers live streaming with ring lights strapped to their phones. They held signs that read, "Brilliance isn't suspicious. Reinstate Jalen. Stop punishing black potential." Danielle stood at the edge of the crowd, arms folded across her chest, her coat zipped up against the wind. She wasn't shouting. She didn't have a sign. But when the reporters swarmed her, she finally spoke. "My son is not an isolated case," she said into a dozen microphones. "He's just the one you caught." Inside the building, Jefferson Hills felt less like a school and more like a fortress. Teachers walked the halls with their heads down. Some closed their doors and didn't teach at all that day. Others tried to continue as normal, but the noise from outside seeped through the windows like truth pressing in. Bellinger didn't show up. Halverson emailed staff saying he would work remotely. Dalton sat in his office, watching the news footage stream live from his phone, jaw clenched. This was no longer a local controversy. National media outlets had begun sending correspondence. The Department of Education had formally opened an investigation. Still, the school board hadn't moved. No apology, no reinstatement, just more silence. By the second day, the crowd had doubled. Chants echoed down the street. "No justice, no peace. Let him learn. Do your job, Dalton." Police arrived by noon, not to de-escalate, but to contain. Barriers were set up along the sidewalk. Officers stood shoulder to shoulder in front of the entrance, hands near their belts, sunglasses hiding their eyes. The image went viral before one. Black parents demanding fairness. White officers forming a wall. Danielle watched from across the street, standing near a group of elders from a local church. "This isn't just about Jalen anymore," one of them said quietly. "This town's been sleeping for years." That evening, a peaceful march turned tense. A student with a bullhorn shouted, "They fear our minds more than our anger." Someone in the crowd threw a water bottle. Not at anyone in particular, but it was enough. Police moved in. 4 students were detained. 1 protester was pushed to the ground. Cell phones caught it all. Zip-tied wrists, tears, scream, and still the school board said nothing. Jalen watched it unfold from their living room couch. He sat still as video clips played on the news, faces he recognized. Friends from school now chanting his name, being dragged into patrol cars. He turned to his mother. "I didn't want this." Danielle sat beside him, placing a hand on his knee. "You didn't cause this." He swallowed hard. "But they're getting hurt for me." She didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "No, baby, they're standing up for themselves. You just gave them a reason." On the 3rd day, the town reached a boiling point. The school board held a private emergency session behind closed doors. The public demanded entry, but were refused. Carmen DeWitt stood on the steps with a megaphone and addressed the crowd. "They don't get to hide behind bureaucracy anymore," she said, her voice rising. "They don't get to bury the brilliance of black children under fear. We're done being silent." The crowd erupted in cheers. Then, just as suddenly, it turned. A group of counter-protesters arrived, clad in school spirit wear, holding signs that read, "Support our teachers. Stand with staff. Excellence must be verified." They didn't shout slurs, but their presence said enough. 2 realities collided on the same sidewalk. Lines were drawn. This wasn't just a school issue anymore. It was a town reckoning with who it truly was. That night, Jalen stayed up past midnight. He sat at the kitchen table, notebooks spread around him, but not to study. He was writing. Danielle didn't ask what. She just brought him tea and kissed the top of his head. On the 4th day, Danielle got a call from the protest organizers. "They want to hear from Jalen," said the voice on the other end. "Tomorrow, at the front of the school. There's going to be a press conference." Danielle looked over at her son, curled up on the couch. "He's just a boy," she said softly. "No," came the voice. "He's a symbol, and symbols change things." She hung up the phone, sat quietly for a while, then turned to Jalen. "They want you to speak," she said. Jalen didn't flinch. He simply asked, "Will it help?" Danielle nodded slowly. "It might." He exhaled. "Then I will." The morning of the press conference, the crowd swelled past 600. Teachers, students, parents, activists, pastors, journalists. The school board locked themselves inside the district office. Jalen stood on a temporary stage made of stacked crates and plywood. He wore a black button-up shirt and jeans. His hands shook slightly, but his face was calm. Danielle stood beside him. Carmen behind. Miss Ellison stood at the front of the crowd, hands clasped. Jalen took the microphone. The crowd hushed. Cameras rolled. He spoke. "I didn't ask for any of this," he began, voice clear. "I just took a test. But when I got a perfect score, they didn't ask how. They assumed I didn't do it. I didn't cheat. I didn't lie. But the second I did something they didn't expect from someone who looks like me, they tried to erase it." He paused. "Swallow. You think being smart would make you safe. It doesn't. Not when they've already decided who you are before you speak." The crowd listened, eyes wide, breath held. Jalen continued. "I studied every night while my mom worked 2 jobs. I taught myself formulas while some of my classmates copied off each other and got away with it." He scanned the crowd. "My only mistake was being better than they were ready to believe." The silence was thick. Then he said, "But I'm not asking for a second chance. I'm demanding a first one." Tears rolled down Danielle's cheeks. Miss Ellison wept quietly. Even some reporters lowered their cameras. But before the applause could swell, a voice cut through the crowd. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp. From the back, "Liar." A man in a red windbreaker stepped forward, holding up a printed sheet. "Your score was too perfect. Nobody gets that high without a system glitch." Security stepped in, but the tension fractured the air. Someone else shouted, "Shut him down." Another, "Let him talk." Voices collided. Arguments broke out. Jalen stood still. Danielle stepped in front of him instinctively, and in the chaos someone hurled a rock toward the stage. It missed, barely. The crowd erupted. His words brought the crowd to tears and fear. When the soon dipped behind the school's facade, and the early evening shadows stretched through the windows of Jefferson Hill's auditorium, Jalen Carter sat backstage, heart pounding in his chest. The crowd he had seen from news clips and live streams, parents, students, reporters, community members, was gathered just beyond the curtain. He heard rustling of chairs, murmurs, the sharp click of camera shutters, and an undertone of tension. Would they listen if he spoke, or would they dismiss him as they always had? Danielle stood a few feet behind him, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. Her scrubs were gone. She wore a simple black dress. She nodded once, quietly, as if to say, "You're ready." Jalen swallowed, ran a hand through his hair, and stepped forward under the glare of stage lights. As he emerged onto that stage, the bright glare momentarily blinded him. When it cleared, he saw their faces, sympathetic, skeptical, curious, and some wary. The microphone stood before him on a stand, left unaltered. Jalen's legs trembled, though he held himself upright. He felt the weight of every stare, the expectation of a truth he had rehearsed so many nights with his mother. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking deep breaths. The auditorium hushed. Then Jalen placed both hands on the sides of the podium. "Good evening," he began, voice low, trembling just slightly. He paused, hearing his own heart, hearing a few people shift in their seats. My name is Jalen Carter. I am 13 years old." He exhaled, scanning the crowd. "They say I cheated on that math test." A murmur rippled through the hall. He let it hang, let them feel that accusation in the air. He raised his chin. "They denied my results. They questioned my answers. They said my work was too perfect." His voice cracked. He hadn't meant it to. A few in the front row exchanged glances. He steadied himself. "But they were never going to believe me." The words echoed in the hall. A silence, thick and pregnant, fell. Then Jalen pushed forward. "Because from the moment I walked into Jefferson Hills, I was invisible, quiet, overlooked. I was that kid who didn't raise his hand. That kid who sat in the back row. That kid they judged by my clothes, by the fact my mom wore a janitor's uniform, by the color of my skin." His voice wavered again, but he pressed on. "I am smart. I am worthy. But most of all, I am real." He let that settle. He spoke again, softer. "Every night my mom would sit beside me under a single lamp after school. She explained equations, proofs, functions. She told me that knowledge doesn't belong to a few. It belongs to all, and I believed her. I trusted her, and I trusted myself." A few sniffles echoed from the back. Cameras zoomed in. Reporters scribbled notes. Jalen's eyes flicked to Danielle, whose face was taut with emotion. She squeezed her hands into fists at her side. "They told me I didn't fit their expectation of a black kid. They told me no one like me scores that high. They judged me before they knew me." He paused, letting that land. Tonight I stand before you, not as a statistic, not as a test score, but as a person they refuse to see. The lights seemed to dim just slightly, as if the building itself leaned in. Jalen's voice regained strength. When I look back on the pictures of us, on the scope of this fight, I see a much bigger story. You see me, but there are thousands more like me. Smart, passionate, silent. He swallowed. His throat hurt. He pressed on. So yes, my speech tonight is not just for me. It's for them, for the kids who were called guesses, instead of students, for the kids who took the blame when someone else refused to believe. They deserve a voice. And if I can be that voice, even briefly, I will. He exhaled again, raw and shaky. The auditorium stayed still. Then, someone from the audience stood up. A white woman in a blazer, opened her mouth but hesitated. Jalen didn't look at her. He looked out at the sea of faces, and then to his mother, who had tears shining in her eyes. Before more could happen, a sharp ring cut through the room. A phone, loud, insistent. Someone in the back booth. The hall jolted. Jalen's heart pounded anew. He stepped back, turning off the mic, but the audience erupted. Applause, shouts, some cries, some skeptical murmurs. The school principal, stunned, stood at the edge of the stage, trying to step forward. The board members exchanged glances. A reporter shouted, "Can you repeat that? What's next? How do you prove it?" Jalen didn't respond. He buried his face in his hands for a moment, breathing hard. Then he looked up, voice soft but firm. "I didn't ask for your belief. I asked for your listening." The lights brightened again. The applause rose. Media flashbulbs popped. Someone in the crowd shouted, "We believe you." Others, "We want justice." But even in that moment, Jalen sensed the edge of danger. His mother moved forward to join him. They stood side by side now. Reporters clamored. Teachers looked stunned. The chairman of the school board got to his feet, but hesitated to speak. A few parents cried. A few looked away. Some whispered. Suddenly, an assistant principal emerged from the shadows, whispering urgently into a phone. Danielle glanced at Jalen, worry in her eyes. Jalen's gaze shifted to the back door, where he thought he might have glimpsed a figure slip out. Just then Danielle's phone buzzed violently in her pocket. She looked down. A message preview popped up, bold and shocking. "Shut him up, or else." Her hand froze on the screen. She looked up at Jalen, horror widening in her eyes, as she stepped back. The auditorium fell into a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. Jalen's next breath caught in his throat. Danielle's fingers shook. Someone in the audience gasped. And in that moment, everyone in that crowded room knew. This was no longer just about belief or bias. It had become a fight for safety. Danielle's car was vandalized, with a chilling message. The next morning, Danielle woke to the acrid sting of smoke drifting into her bedroom. She shot upright in her bed, her heart slamming. She smelled familiar pages turning to ash. She bolted from the room toward the window and froze. Across the driveway, Jalen's tutoring shed, where he and his mother had kept piles of notebooks, formula binders, and old contest problems, was smoldering. Blackened, warped wood stood against broken glass. The smell of charred paper filled the yard. Danielle ran outside in her slippers, calling Jalen's name. He came running too, still half asleep, confusion etched across his face. His eyes widened, horrified when he took in the scene. His notebooks, pages of proof, scribbled margins, the little error corrections Danielle had made nights earlier, were consumed by flame. The windows smeared with soot, frames twisted, smoke rose in gray plume. A few neighbors had gathered, whispering, backs turned, or staring with pity. Danielle pressed a hand over her mouth, fighting the tears. Jalen stood frozen, silent, a burning book in his direction. She reached for him, but he didn't move. He just stared. "Mom," he began, voice small and broken. She moved to his side, guiding him gently away from the ruin. They stood a moment in stunned silence. Someone in the crowd coughed. A fire engine arrived in the distance, the siren echoing through the quiet street. But their silence held longer, heavy with loss. His study materials were gone, the physical proof of his journey, erased in a single violent act. News spread fast. The local news van arrived. Cameras rolled. Reporters clamored for statements. Danielle, her voice quivering but firm, addressed the crowd. "This is not just an attack on our home. This is an attack on truth, on his voice, on knowledge. Jalen stood next to her, shoulders rigid, eyes hollow. They were doing this not just to damage property, but to intimidate. Meanwhile, online, the intimidation grew. The list of websites and social media pages that had previously doxed Jalen's tutor sessions now escalated. They posted addresses, claimed authorship, urged action, and gloated over the fire. Trolls shouted that the fire was deserved, that the family was lying, that this is what happens when you cheat. The hostility amplified overnight. Even more terrifying, Danielle discovered someone anonymously had posted video footage of the fire, time-stamped to the hour she and Jalen had both been out. It implied they had set it themselves, or staged it, a vicious lie, but one that would seed doubt in the minds of those already skeptical. Yet amid the ashes, Danielle refused to retreat. She looked at Jalen with fierce determination. "We carry on," she said. "We rise from this." Her voice shook, but the conviction in it galvanized them both. She registered Jalen for the National Math Olympiad that same morning. She told him, "They want to erase your proof. We'll produce new evidence. We'll respond with brilliance, not fear." Jalen nodded, tears in his eyes, and swallowed hard. The weight of the next weeks would be heavier than ever. In the days leading up to the Olympiad, Danielle reinvented their study regimen. They rented a quiet room in the local library at night. After hours, they borrowed community classroom space. She arranged for a trusted former professor to proctor mock exams. Jalen worked through pages of problems by flashlight when the power flickered. They rebuilt their own archives. Every night, each page he wrote felt like resistance. On the day of the Olympiad, tension simmered across the testing center at a nearby university. Jalen entered the hall, his jacket buttoned, contest ID in hand. The room was packed. Students from around the country, examiners, journalists rumored to attend. Danielle sat outside in a waiting room, breathing deeply, praying silently. The stakes felt global. Jalen sat at his desk, hands trembling slightly, but steadied by months of adversity. The proctors handed out materials. When the exam began, he inhaled and sank into equations, proofs, combinatorics, integrals, geometry. Time stretched. The silence deepened. He worked through each problem with precision and confidence. When he encountered a tricky combinatorial identity, he remembered his mother's voice. "Break it down, question each step, don't assume the obvious." He did just that, slowly rewrote the steps, reached the result. As time ticked away, he scribbled, erased, rewrote. The hall clock ticked in his peripheral vision. When the final minutes came, he checked his answers twice, sealed his booklet, and walked out. He felt hollow and full at once. Relief, exhaustion, tension. Outside, cameras were already there. Reporters jostled. Danielle rushed to him, steadying him, smiling through tears. He had done it. He had faced fire and accusation, and still sat for the same test that had started all this. Within hours, results flooded in, and Jalen dominated. He scored near perfect, placed first in the state round, cementing a path to nationals. The news outlets that had whispered cheat now ran headlines. Janitor's son triumphs in National Math Showdown. Silenced student speaks through numbers. Social media lit up. Support poured in. People who had refused to see him now had to look. But the unexpected twist. During the ceremony where top scorers were announced, someone in the audience stood up, not applauding, but filming. A uniformed university recruiter had been present, framed in the back row, his phone steady as he captured Jalen's reaction when his name was called. After the crowd erupted, the recruiter didn't join the applause. He watched carefully, with a certain weight, almost calculation in his eyes. Danielle noticed him as she and Jalen exited, the room still buzzing. She nudged Jalen's arm. "Look," she whispered. Jalen turned. The recruiter nodded slightly, pocketed his phone and left without fanfare. As Jalen and his mother walked through the corridor, reporters swarmed, cells clicked, voices thundered, questions pressed. But in that swirl, that recruiter's silent presence loomed. Jalen swallowed, glancing back at the auditorium entrance. Danielle gripped his hand tighter. Something was shifting. Something bigger than the school. A university recruiter stood in the back, watching quietly. The night after Jalen's Olympiad victory, cameras and headlines glowed across every news site. "Quiet kid becomes national math champion." They tried to silence him. He answered with calculus. the janitor's son who beat the doubters. Yet in the echoing halls of Jefferson Hills, that triumph changed nothing. The school board still refused to expunge the cheating allegation. The principal wouldn't retract the public doubt cast on Jalen's name. Danielle sat across a polished oak table in the boardroom, flanked by her lawyer and a few supporters from the protest movement. The board members, some flushed, some stern, sat on the opposite side. The walls bore plaques and mottos about academic integrity and excellence. Danielle's voice was steady, but her fingers drummed with impatience. "This isn't just about my son's reputation," she said. "This is about fairness, policy, and dignity. I demand that you resign if you cannot do either." A hush. Board Chairwoman Leland, her face taut, responded, "We will consider your demands. But reinstatement and removal of all records requires due process, review of all evidence. We cannot simply bow to pressure." Danielle's eyes narrowed. "I will not accept consideration. I want action, and I want it today." Murmurs rippled among the board. Outside, a crowd gathered not just from the town, but from districts beyond. Thanks to social media and major outlets covering Jalen's story, buses of supporters had converged. Signs read "Justice for Jalen," "Black Excellence," "Not a Threat," "Erase Bias, Not Brilliance." The media setup rivaled a political speech. The parking lot was loud with chanting. Drone cameras hovered overhead. The scheduled final hearing was set in the school auditorium. The entire nation watched via live streams, news channels, and social feeds. Danielle insisted on transparency. Jalen insisted on a platform to tell his truth one last time. The board relented, but under their terms, strict time limits, pre-approved speakers, and no public commentary afterward. When the day came, the auditorium was packed beyond capacity. Journalists lined the aisles with microphones. The stage was flanked by the board, school lawyers, attorneys for Danielle and Jalen, and a host who would moderate the hearing. Cameras from local and national networks framed every face. Danielle rose first, her heart steady. She recounted everything: her masters, her secret tutoring, Jalen's discipline, the fire, the vandalism, the recordings, the data of racial bias they'd uncovered. Her tone held both gravitas and raw vulnerability. "We are not arguing whether he is smart," she said. "We are challenging your refusal to see him as fully human, worthy of belief until proven otherwise." Several in the audience whispered, tissues fluttered, hands clutched signs. When Jalen was called, silence pressed heavily in the room. He emerged into the light, walking slowly, eyes forward. He addressed the board, but flicked a glance to the crowd, to Danielle. His voice was calm, deeper now. "I'm not asking for your pity," he said. "I'm asking for what any student deserves, your trust until you disprove me. You accused me, threatened me, questioned me, but you never asked who I was. You judged by tests, by doubt, by prejudice. But I stand here today, not because I proved myself to you. I stand because I believed in myself when no one else would." He turned the tables. He directed attention to the school's policies, their disproportionate discipline records, their bias and test anomalies. He showed graph after graph of data his legal team uncovered. Black students flagged for suspicion, differential test score reviews, opaque grading policies. Some board members glanced at each other in discomfort. The moderator called time, but the room buzzed. Then came the testimony from Ms. Ellison, the teacher who confessed earlier. She repeated her statements, bare and trembling, about how she'd been pressured. "Watch the black kids' tests." Heads in the audience dropped. Several parents gasped. When the school's lawyer presented their counter-argument, they tried to paint Jalen's perfect test scores as anomalies, asking the board to assign him to probation, not full clearance. A few board members looked uneasy. One whispered to another, "This is worse than we thought." Suddenly, an unexpected twist. The school district's own internal review director, who had stayed behind the scenes until then, stood. He cleared his throat and said, "I have new evidence to present." He projected documents on a screen, memos showing internal directives from years ago, staff meeting minutes ordering heightened scrutiny of minority student performance, internal emails referencing protect reputation rather than ensuring equity. Board members flinched. Attorneys scrambled. The crowd outside audibly gasped. Danielle's lawyer shot a look at Jalen, who sat rigid. The moderator called a short recess as board members conferred in hushed tones behind closed doors. When they returned, the atmosphere felt irrevocably changed. After deliberation, the board chair cleared her throat. The room was silent, cameras poised, she announced. After thorough consideration, the board votes as follows. Danielle's heart pounded. Jalen's name turned white in his throat. Reporters leaned forward. Supporters held their breath. Then she read, "By a narrow margin, we deny full expungement of the cheating allegation. However, we will reinstate Mr. Carter's academic record provisionally, pending oversight, review, and further appeals. We also decline to resign at this time." A collective gasp rose from the audience. Danielle's face contorted in shock. Jalen's eyes flickered in disbelief. Supporters began shouting, "No, this isn't enough." Some stood, some cried out. The school lawyers smirked quietly. The board members turned stiff. The moderator tried to restore order. Danielle's attorney challenged the decision. Jalen trembled, anger and heartbreak clashing behind his eyes. As the crowd descended into chaos, whispers spread. "They still won't clear him. They're saving face. This is only halfway justice." Reporters rushed to microphones. Danielle, voice shaking, shouted, This is not the end." The room buzzed. People stormed from seats, shouting, crying, accusing. In the mix, the board chair started packing her papers, anxious faces behind her. Jalen gripped Danielle's hand, silent tears brimming. The night outside waited, full of chants, placards, flashing lights. And behind the stage curtains, someone slipped a folded letter into Danielle's hand. She unfolded it. Her eyes widened as she read just one line, whispered on paper. "You pushed too far. You'll regret this." Every head in the room halted as she gasped, and the board's decision stunned even their own staff. The morning air in Jefferson Hills felt electric. Word had spread across news networks overnight. The board had reversed the suspension, cleared Jalen's name, and issued a formal public apology. 3 officials had resigned. The district was rolling out new equity standards, anti-bias training for all staff, and a community oversight committee with teeth. Jalen had received an early admission offer from MIT, contingent on his grades and community leadership. The magnitude of it all left the town buzzing, and Danielle quietly resolute. She arrived at the school's main entrance well before the public ceremony. Reporters lined the drive, cameras glinting in the sunlight. Students and parents gathered behind barricades, holding signs like "Say his name with respect," and "From silence to scholarship." Jalen, dressed in a crisp white shirt and navy blazer, stood beside her. He looked calm, though his jaw was firm, eyes bright with a kind of quiet pride. Inside the auditorium, the same stage that had hosted hearings, protests and speeches, now hosted redemption. The board chair, her face tight but composed, stepped to the podium. Her voice resonated. "To the Carter family, to Jefferson Hills students, to all who watched with hope and doubt, you deserve a full apology. We were wrong. We failed in upholding equity and dignity. We hereby rescind all allegations against Jalen Carter. We accept the resignations of 3 board members and commit to structural reform." Applause and tears rumbled through the room. Danielle stood, her heart a cocktail of relief and solemnity. When it was her turn, she sashayed to the podium, not to gloat, but to testify to the truth. "I was always his tutor, and always his believer," she said, gazing first at Jalen, then at the crowd. Her voice was steady, gentle, full of love. "He didn't need validation. He needed justice." She paused, letting that settle. The room exhaled, many wiping eyes. Cameras swallowed her words. Then Jalen stood. His voice was clear, stronger than ever. "Today isn't just about me. It's about every child who has been judged before being heard. It's about dismantling the narratives that say your skin defines your potential." The audience erupted in support. People rose to their feet. Applause, tears, chants. Some held their phones high, recording. Others cried openly. The local superintendent, previously silent in all controversies, stepped forward. He announced the new policies: mandatory anti-bias certification for all teachers, a rotating equity review board including students and parents, transparency over testing and grading. He pledged funds for tutoring programs, mentorship pipelines, and scholarships targeting underrepresented students. It was a sweeping change, one that looked for once like meaningful reform. As the ceremony ended, Danielle and Jalen walked into the lobby. Outside, media vans hummed, and supporters crowded the sidewalks. A reporter stepped toward them, mic extended. "Jalen, what's next?" Another asked, "Do you feel vindicated now?" Danielle answered, "They finally said his name with respect. But our work is just beginning. Jalen nodded, glancing over the sea of faces. But behind that moment of victory, an unexpected twist waited. A man in a dark suit approached quietly from behind the crowd, speaking into an earpiece. His face was unfamiliar. He paused when he recognized Danielle, then slipped away into a van parked nearby. Danielle didn't notice. She hugged Jalen, tears shining, and whispered, "This is for you." The crowd cheered. Cameras clicked. Headlines lit up across states. The Carters had won. Yet as they parted to leave, Danielle's phone pinged. She glanced down. A push notification startled her. Federal bill introduced, Jalen's law to mandate school equity measures nationwide. Her eyes widened. She looked up at Jalen, stunned. The room seemed to hush around her. She pocketed the phone, her heartbeat thudding. She met Jalen's gaze, eyes full of questions. The crowd streamed past. The man in the van's tinted windows glinted. Something bigger than Jefferson Hills was stirring. Something beyond local law and optics. The applause dimmed behind them, but in Danielle's mind, one chilling thought rose. No matter how far they walked, no matter how loud the victory sounded, this story was never just theirs. But what Danielle didn't know was that her story would become national law. No child should have to prove their humanity just to be heard. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or underestimated, this story was for you. Type yes